All right, welcome back to another episode of the Low Stick Podcast. My name is Eric Detman. I'm here with my co-host, Jason Retz. And before we introduce our guest for the second time, just want to talk about how great it was to have so many people like, subscribe, and interact with our last podcast. As most of you probably know, we were giving away a free Koros watch based on a keyword, special word, kind of whatever you want to talk about or say it is. But that was super exciting. So we're super thankful for all of you for listening and continuing to listen. So today we have Dr. Jeff Messer on the podcast again. We, Jason, I you look into the data a little bit more than I do, but I think the last time we had Dr. Messer on, it was it has been our most listened to podcast. And the
Yeah, and
feedback.
there were several people. There were several people that told me they listened to it two or three times and just pulled stuff out each time they listened to it. So we may not have had more listeners, but we had more listens than we've ever had for any of our
Yeah.
our podcasts. So that's pretty awesome.
And anytime you can get Dr. Messer in in a room with you and just pick his brain about training is a pretty special day. So we're really, really excited to have you back on, Dr. Messer. Thanks for joining us.
Well, you're too kind, my friend. And Eric, as you know well, it's Jeff, as it is for Jason,
Yeah.
obviously. It's Jeff always. Thank you guys for having me back on. It was great to see you in Boulder. It was another epic event. And I should tell you that when I think about my Mount Rushmore of educational opportunities, certainly Boulder Running Clinics and Low Stick Podcast is on it now. I realize, and I'm going to say this with embarrassment and transparency, I went for too long without being a faithful, dutiful listener. I made an excuse why I was too busy, and now I'm dialed, so to speak. So it is one of my educational cornerstones. So I appreciate what you gentlemen do for the sport, and I appreciate how you uplift young learners. So thank you for having me back.
Yeah. Yeah, we're excited. So Jason, I'll let you kick it off because I know you got a couple things.
Yeah, okay. So we had some great conversations when we were out in Boulder talking about a variety of different things. And one of the things Eric and I really enjoyed about Boulder this year was how so many people are effective at their training, doing it in slightly different ways, but accomplishing the same goals based on where they were or whatever it might be. So I think, we've got a few things planned, but let's just kick this off. There's a lot of terminologies that people throw around, VO2 or threshold or economy or a variety of different terminologies. And sometimes we intermix those maybe to our own liking and maybe not necessarily what the science is. But in your brain, regardless of what the term is, if I was to say, okay, from here to here is recovery, from here to here is blank, here to here is what, not necessarily caring what the term is, what are some of the key things as far as effort concerned for an athlete that I'm trying to create an adaptive change for? Um, and the reason I bring that up is just because we hear so many different terms that are intermixed. What are the stimuluses that we're specifically trying to look for?
That's a great question. And thank you for starting off with an exceptionally difficult question. I appreciate that. That's well done. And that's fair, though. I appreciate it very much because I think you touch on a very accurate point. That is to say, to my knowledge, there really is an absence of a universal language and an absence of universal definitions. So, what I might call tempo, someone might call threshold, and vice versa. What I might call economy, someone might call efficiency, and vice versa. So, I think it is difficult to have a conversation with common terminology simply because it doesn't exist. That being said, one thing I've tried to do is leverage my background as a scientist by not overthinking the science. And I'll give you an example of that. The only way, the only way one is going to know where the lactate threshold is or the so-called lactate turn points are, if you think there are two, is to go into a laboratory and put someone through a progressive protocol that allows quantification of lactate levels at multiple exercise intensities. Beyond that, it's an estimation, which is one reason why Eric Detman's question last year was so elegant. How do you determine threshold or tempo or whatever you want to call it? I think it's much more about feel and the art of coaching than it is, for example, the science, because the only place I know of for sure that tests athletes and does full lactate profiling right now, and I'm sure there are multiple, but the only place I know for a fact that I can attest to is Augustana University because I work there and I do it, even though I'm not coaching the team.
Yeah.
So I help with it twice a year because that's what the coach wants for the team, and that's fine. But beyond that, I think we have to extrapolate and make our best judgment based on the art of coaching. So that being said, I think at high school age, I think there's probably a stimulus to enhance fitness at the vast majority of intensities. So I've heard, for example, and I won't name names unless you force me to, but probably won't name names anyway, at least unless we're face to face over a refreshment. But I've heard some prominent college coaches say, for example, that going out for less than a half an hour is a waste of time. And I disagree with that. And I've heard some say that running easy is a relative waste of time. I disagree with that, particularly as it applies to high school age student athletes who are at such an early stage of development. I think there's an absolute place for relaxed running that can be moderated by a talk test. That is to say, if two people can carry on a conversation that's not interrupted consequent to the intensity of the run, then I think that's fine for a so-called recovery or relaxed run. And I think individuals in that 14 to 18-year-old age range should do that more than one time per week, even at an elite level. And you all know, because I think you gentlemen may, and I can't recall, I've just given it, but you all may have, for example, JoJo's plan or one of my plans, because I've shared so many. You guys would know, therefore, that all JoJo did every single Friday was run for 30 minutes at a relaxed pace. That was it. That was it. He was running with teammates who couldn't break 4:45 for the mile.
Yeah.
And that was fine. That was fine. So I think in terms of recovery running, talk test, that's a very good place to start. When I think about moderate intensity running, I think about what I call palpable, sustainable effort. So you know you're working, but it's very sustainable. So you can run, for example, for an hour if you're relatively well developed as a high school student athlete. And at the end of that hour run, you could run 1.5 to 2 more miles if you needed to. So you've exerted yourself, you've felt the effort, but it wasn't hard, if you will. It wasn't particularly challenging, but it was palpable. It was moderate in nature. And so those qualitative descriptors, I think, are good and have value for high school age student athletes to learn to assess as they assess their feedback from their body, as they learn their bodies as student athletes of an interscholastic age range. Mm-hmm. And then threshold, I think, is more challenging running. And the phrase that I use there is one that's carried me fairly well the last few years. I call it challenging, yet attainable, and therefore sustainable running. So it's challenging. It is very much a palpable effort, but it's attainable. If I'm assigned a 2-mile or a 4-mile threshold run, if the pacing is right, if the coach has applied the art tactfully, then I can attain that run. If I come to practice well prepared, I am well hydrated, I am well rested, I am well fueled. It is challenging yet attainable. And then sustainable, I define as follows. If it's sustainable, that means I can recover within 48 to 72 hours. In other words, if my coach has me do it on a Monday and hypothetically asks me to run an up-tempo effort again on a Wednesday, I would be recovered. Whether he does or not, I would be recovered. And certainly by 72 hours. So challenging yet attainable, and therefore sustainable. And then I think about what I call near maximal or maximal intensity running. And this was such a valuable part of the Boulder Running Clinic this year because we all heard Mike Scannell, and I'm glad all three of us were there because if I misspeak and misrepresent Mike, you all can correct me, as I know Mike would, and I'd invite that if Mike were here. Mike talked about his relative reluctance to do high intensity running with high school age student athletes. And so I'm all about that, but I think the one note I wrote down, and I never write down notes at clinics, I just listen and try to commit to my modest cognitive capacity, if you will. But what I wrote down is what Mike said, I'll never run mile goal pace for more than 60 seconds at a time. So if you think about that operationally, that means you can do high intensity or relatively high intensity running for 15, 30, even 45, even 50 seconds and induce a stimulus that may be near maximal or even maximal, depending on what you want to do. 150 meters, nearly all out or all out.
Yeah.
So when I think about high intensity or maximal intensity running, I think about those short, brief efforts that probably approximate 1,500 to 800, maybe even 800 to 400 meter pace.
And I think that's so valuable to not get hung up on the terminology when we're listening to somebody talk and understand the effort that they're doing. And I bring that up, my son's going through the college recruiting process and he had a coach say, we do about 10 miles at threshold effort. And Lance is smart enough to kind of understand what that means. And like that would be very difficult to do 10 miles at threshold effort. Like it's just not possible. And so then he asked some good questions and I think Lance was just trying to define what that was, but the coach was kind of caught up on what the term was and that it was threshold and that was not the what we're going for. So I think how you defined it there is perfect. Don't get caught up. Figure out what that effort is. Is it sustainable? Are we doing short bursts? What is that? And I think that's super important.
Yeah. Let me ask you a question. This was actually something that somebody asked me in Boulder, and I was like, I am not the right person to ask this, but if you ask Jeff, he could probably give you a really good answer. So let's say that you've got like an elite, sub-elite, like a high level kid who's been running consistently for years. In
Okay.
January, you have them do, whatever, 2Ks at threshold. That coach asked if your 2K threshold pace in January, and again, I'm going to throw a pace out, and we're all in agreement. It's more of a feel thing, but relative, right? Around 515. How much could you expect that kid's threshold to improve from January until May of a really high level kid who's been training consistently?
That's a really, really good question. I can only answer it, I think, from experience, and it may not even be an answer, Eric, but it's definitely a response. So I know of no evidence-based response I can offer. That is to say, I don't think that question's been treated experimentally because it would take a study, for example, it extended across 3 or 4 months, and those are frightfully rare, all too rare. But I think experientially, what I've seen with those higher developed runners, if I can improve their threshold pace by 3 to 4% across the season, I'm relatively happy. And I always think about it in percentage terms because, again, for an 8 minute miler, that relatively young freshman who's really underdeveloped in the sport, he or she is trying to get maybe to 7:30 as a miler. That's a very different dynamic than that 4:10 miler or that 4:30 miler who's trying to get to 4:05 or 4:22. So I think about it in percentage terms. And if I can improve it by 2 to 4, ideally, I'd like to improve it by 4 to 5%. That's sometimes a little bit audacious. And so I settle in that 2 to 4% range. And so if I'm at 515, for example, and I can achieve a 4% improvement over the course of 3 months, then that translates to about 13 seconds. So 515 becomes 502. And if I can do that for 2K reps across a series of 3 months, then I feel like I'm making progress literally and figuratively.
I love that.
It seems very attainable.
I think so. I think so. And I'll be the first to say, and you gentlemen know me well, I may set my goals too conservatively. Perhaps if I was a university level coach, I'd be more aggressive either by necessity to maintain my employment or by desire because I thought I had more developed runners or both. But with high school athletes, as I talked about in the breakout session that Jay allowed me to lead in Kelly's absence, I think it's important to, if you make a mistake, certainly make it on the side of conservatism so that two things occur. They're not, quote unquote, overtrained and they're not, quote unquote, injured. If you can avoid those two outcomes and just maintain consistency, I think the probability of multiple successes is probably well in excess of 80%, maybe even higher.
Does that percentage change female versus male?
I don't think so. That's a great question. But I think when you get to, and I'll frame it from your context there, you talked about higher level individuals. So maybe that 425 boy or that 415 boy, maybe that 456 girl or that 448 girl. I think when they get into those ranges, my experience, whether it's a JoJo or a Danny, whether it's a Tara Erdman or a Sohib Disa, typically if I can get 2 to 4%, I'm content. And if I get that 5% or even a little more across 3 months, I'm very, very happy.
Awesome.
So let's extrapolate on some of those conversations that we were having at Boulder.
Okay.
Um, since we're talking about paces of things right now, let's talk about potentially how you phrase it as repetition pace spectrum training.
Yeah.
Okay. You want to explain that for the person who has no idea what we're referring to?
So let me try because here's an idea that has been on my mind for years. I have used it with JoJo extensively, to a lesser extent with Danny a decade ago. Certainly used it with Sohai last year. But the idea is basically this. Excuse me. So perhaps you gentlemen grew up like I did, where when I ran a workout, I might do 4 or 5 times a mile. And that was my workout. So I do a warm up. I do 4 or 5 times a mile, or maybe 5 or 6 times a kilometer. And then I do a warm down. And that was my day. Maybe I'd add 2 or 3 strides at the end, but that was basically my day. The mile repetitions or the 1,000 meter repeats, that was my training day. That was my workout. So I remember thinking that that might not optimize what I call the cardiovascular neuromuscular stimulus. So I started to refine that and do what I call combination workouts, which I think both you gentlemen do, where instead of running just, for example, 6 times a K, I'd run 6 times a K and 6 times 200. And so I try to get some aerobic power work, as I call it, and I try to get some neuromuscular stimulus or race specific pace stimulus, all embodied or included or enveloped in one workout. And physiologically, that's entirely reasonable. That's entirely reasonable. So that's been a guiding parameter for me. But I think as I continue to read the literature, particularly in the last 18 months, there may be a value in constructing multiple workouts that really hit a range of paces. And I'll tell you what I mean exactly. So you can see this in JoJo's plan repeatedly. And so he would start a workout at maybe threshold pace or even slower than threshold pace. So let's just say JoJo's threshold pace was 5 minutes per mile. So he might do his first repetitions at 5:10, then get to 5 minutes and then 450. But we would work all the way down in that workout to maybe something like 330 mile pace. Now, at 330 mile pace, we might be doing 150 meters of running or 200 meters of running, but we would run the spectrum of paces through that workout. And as you gentlemen know, we would do relatively high volumes. He would do typically 8,000 meters or more of track repetitions in a workout. Now, he's a bit of a unicorn. So that's not going to happen with a 14-year-old freshman, male or female. But still, the concept can extrapolate. And what I think I'm learning from the literature is it takes a spectrum of paces to provide a comprehensive stimulus to mitochondria, to skeletal muscle. If I want comprehensive adaptation in, for example, both mitochondrial content or quantity and mitochondrial quality, if I want everything, if you will, then I probably need a spectrum of paces. And the more often I can do that, the more comprehensive my adaptations will be. So in the last 5 years, I've gone to those type of workouts when we do on Monday, Thursday. We'll include some threshold, but eventually, and particularly in January, it's primarily threshold. But what we're working toward is always now repetition pace spectrum workouts, not just thousands and 200s, not just 800s and 300s, but starting up around a mile maybe. Threshold work, we'll do a mile, then another mile of threshold, and working all the way down to 300s, 200s, 150s at 1500 meter or 800 meter goal pace. So we're covering the entire spectrum of applicable paces in any given or single workout. I think there's merit to the idea. I'll spare you the science because when I mentioned that or offered that long answer at the beginning of the clinic, I thought I was going to be bludgeoned and thrown out of the clinic before it even started. I won't talk about the quote unquote human phosphoproteome and skeletal muscle. That's a way to lose friends quickly. But that's the type of science that I think holds promise for us when we're working at the margins. And just to put a finer point on that, if I'm working with a 14-year-old freshman, candidly, I don't care about that. I care about that person being engaged, happy, healthy, and learning to run, building relationships, and becoming fitter aerobically. If I'm Mike Scannell, and I've got 2 bronze medals with my most elite athlete, and I want to make sure those 2 bronze are ultimately complemented before he retires by 1 or 2 goals, I'm literally working at the margins to get everything I can, then I'm absolutely doing that. I have that much belief right now that I'm absolutely doing that kind of workout. So is it appropriate in high school? Probably not for that 14-year-old freshman who's new to the sport, but for someone like JoJo, Eric, your top young lady is Ellery.
Yes.
I look at Ellery's incredible resume and I think to myself, if she's not already doing it, and with you, she probably is, but if she's not already doing it, Ellery is at a level where I think she can handle that and do it really effectively. Sohaib Disa last year, as you know, ran 401. He was a guy who could handle it, and he did a lot of that work. So can I guarantee you it adds unique value or is a new idea that's going to make us all better? I can't do that. That would be just too bold or egregious an interpretation of emerging science. But do I think it's a concept to be aware of? And do I think it's easily infused into workouts? I do, because I've done it now for several years. So it's something to think about and at least be open to considering.
So
Mhm.
let me ask you this. Sorry to interrupt you, Eric.
No, we both have so many questions.
Well, so maybe 2019 at Boulder, maybe 2020. You and I talked about this specifically, Jeff, a little bit about knowing what the recovery or the transition on these paces is from a threshold effort to something that's marginally faster to faster. You know, how do we necessarily give the athlete the right amount of rest during the workout to be able to hit the stimulus that we're trying to achieve without it getting out of control too soon? How do we measure those intervals for rest? What do we do? I mean, as a rough example.
So, Jason, when you say out of control, do you mean prematurely fatiguing so they can't finish the workout, for example?
Correct, correct.
Okay. So I go back to maybe a disingenuous or overly simplistic concept. When in doubt, give more rest, right? And that may be, and again, I invite you, again, I'll just share this with you as my peers. I always think about this from percentage terms. In other words, if I'm giving a minute 15 seconds rest and I change that to a minute 35, on an absolute basis, you might say that's only 20 seconds. But on a relative basis, that's over 30% additional metabolic recovery. So I always think about my rest intervals from a percentage basis as I build them. And then the way I build them, as you gentlemen have seen, if JoJo or Sohaib or anybody I have worked with is doing a threshold mile, for example, as he or she progresses down to 150s, after the threshold repetition, they might only rest a minute to 90 seconds because, as you gentlemen and I probably would accept or agree or align, that's all they require. But as those repetitions become faster, I try to systematically add rest, whether it's 20 seconds per repetition or 25 seconds per repetition. I just try to make it systematic in terms of the increments to rest. And so I typically work within a 1 to 3 minute range for rest. So with those first repetitions at threshold, maybe it's just a minute rest, maybe 75 seconds. But by the time they get down to doing, for example, 150s at 800-meter or faster goal pace, like JoJo would run those on 2.5 minutes rest. So think about that. He's working at a 1 to 5 or higher work to rest ratio, 1 to 5 or higher. And so that 1 to 3 minute range for rest intervals to me has proven to be, to your point, Jason, again, challenging, yet attainable and therefore sustainable. You make a great point. How do I control it so the workout isn't exhaustive? That range from 1 to 3 minutes has been, for me, I'll call it money or call it secret sauce, call it what you want to, for lack of a more formal term. But that's been very effective for me in terms of trying to achieve workouts that are attainable and recovery that can occur within 48, certainly at most 72 hours, but typically within 48.
So let me ask you this, Jeff, and I think I know the answer, but I just want you to clarify.
Please.
Based on what we're saying right here, like in your opinion, there's not too many systems you can work in one workout.
You're absolutely right, Eric. And so here's the vignette for you gentlemen to consider. And again, everything I share, this is shared among peers with no sense that I'm right and I know more than anyone else. I'll just share a transparent answer for you to process and tell me at your discretion if you think I'm right or wrong. I spoke down in Texas, gosh, must have been 6, 8 years ago. Long story short, I'm on the podium with Juris Green and Dan Green. The three of us are doing presentations that weekend. So, well, first of all, I'm out of my league. I'm with two icons. But second of all, when I did one of my presentations that weekend, I talked about these combination workouts and I got done or completed that one presentation. And there must have been 40 coaches from Texas who followed me out the back of the room to ask me, can you do those? Don't those workouts compromise because you're touching multiple energy systems? And so, no, in no way, shape, or form is that inconsistent. I've seen some of the social media posts over the years. I remember one or two prominent ones where my phone got blown up by people asking me, is this accurate or not? But no, you can work across all three of those primary metabolic pathways that provide energy production, skeletal muscle. You can work across all three in a workout like I just articulated and be absolutely fine.
Which is awesome because, Eric, we've talked about this in the past. If we're trying to run something faster than threshold or even threshold, how do we get the threshold to start, right? We don't need to. We can get there as we need to across those zones and those ranges in order to get to what we need to. The first 400 meters of a VO2 800 that we're running is not at VO2. We are floating across those ranges in order to get to that stimulus.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. Absolutely agreed. The system is quote unquote ramping up.
Yes.
Formally stated, we call it a metabolic transient, but call it what you will, ramping up, adjusting, whatever you want to call it.
So in short, it's not that complicated. Change your paces, run a little faster as you go, and give them ample rest.
So I will say two things to you, gentlemen, because of my respect for both of you and the desire to be transparent. Number one, Jason, I completely agree. I try to honor 30 plus years of being an empiricist and natural scientist by not overdoing the science.
Yeah.
Because I think we do a disservice not only to the science, but also most importantly to the student athletes by overdoing the science. I try to recognize and honor it because I do have reverence for it, but I try not to overdo it. And candidly, without giving away names, because I could put myself at risk here for some unpleasant interactions. But let me just say, you have very prominent influencers in the running space who utilize social media and will tell you, for example, how much they know about mitochondria and how they can talk about mitochondria with the best of them. I heard that quote one time. And what's being said is just wrong. I mean, if you're really reading the literature, and I can tell oftentimes by the language they use if they have any commitment at all to reading that literature. And what I hear all too often from names both of you would know, and I know all too well, is that they just don't read the literature. They may read abstracts and try to make a case that sounds seductive. And so, again, to come back, Jason, to your point, I try not to overdo the science. And so that's why in Boulder, when I was asked, I was candid. I used the phrase or word phosphoproteome. But after I said that to the group, I promised not to use it again the entire weekend, and I hope I didn't.
That's too funny.
Yeah, I don't think I heard that again. So
Good, good. I'm glad then, because once was enough.
yeah. So let me ask you this, because we're kind of wrapping up on time. We're at
Okay.
26 minutes. Um, Double threshold.
Yes.
Everybody talks about it, right? Everybody
Yes.
asks about it, but you've got a different D threshold. You want to chat about that for a second?
So I'm glad to. And it's an idea that just evolved from, and again, Eric, I think you are particularly sensitive to this in the way you, for example, construct volume daily and weekly to safeguard your student athletes. I think Jason has that same focus. And so our focus, if I can speak for the three of us, knowing that you both will correct me at your discretion, I think we're all very focused on not overtraining and not inducing chronic fatigue that is maladaptive and potentially injurious. We never want to do that. That being said, when double threshold gained what I'll just call or generalize as significant traction a number of years ago, and I began to receive calls from college coaches, university coaches, high school athletes I didn't even know asking me about it. One of my concerns was, is a high school athlete really benefiting him or herself if they're in a building for 7+ hours a day and then they want to achieve a double threshold session and they potentially sacrifice any sleep to do so? And so to me, that trade-off is not beneficial because I will continue to argue that the data tell us sleep is your figurative and literal superpower. And so I'm cautious about that. So I started to think, well, how am I going to do this with someone who is relatively elite, like an Ellery or a JoJo? Because those are the ones who might benefit from it. So I'm going to distribute it instead of double it. And so what we did with JoJo, and that's why I have that calculation, that percentage calculation at the end of every week for every week that an individual trains in my Excel file that I've shared with you gentlemen. I want to see how much volume I can accumulate at threshold. And so in JoJo's case, we take that volume up around 22, 23% of total weekly mileage. And sometimes we'd even tip it above 25% of total weekly mileage, but we'd never do more than one training session a day. And the way we do it is we get a session on Monday, what you and I call it a workout, and that would include a significant threshold component. Same on Thursday, workout, significant threshold component. Saturday, long run, significant threshold component at the conclusion or the last portion of the run. And then on Wednesday, we'd what I call nickel and dime, maybe put in a mile and a half at most at threshold. So if you do that over the course of a week with just a single training session, I think you could distribute and accumulate an enormous volume of threshold running. And I would argue, I'd be glad to hear a different perspective. But again, I keep coming back to challenging yet attainable and therefore sustainable. I look at threshold volume as incredibly recoverable. A high school age person doesn't even have to be an elite high school age individual such as Ellery or JoJo. A high school age student athlete, if he or she comes prepared to practice, sleeps consistently, hydrates uncompromisingly, and is compliant with their coach, and their coach applies the science artistically, that individual can recover from multiple threshold sessions in a week and across 2 weeks, across a month, across the season. So that's really the idea, that you can accumulate a large volume and recover and maintain health and therefore progress without very strenuous training stimuli if you choose to ignore those or alleviate those from your program.
Yeah. So if we're talking about an Ellery JoJo, right? 22 up to 25% of threshold. Let's take the outliers out of the equation, right?
Okay.
Let's think about like our 1640 5K boy or our 1930 5K girl, very good runners, right? But not the elite of the elite. Are you doing that same volume of threshold with them? Is it dependent on weekly volume? Is it dependent on age, running? Does that make sense what I'm asking?
It does. And I think I'll distill it. You'll tell me if I'm wrong. I'll distill it to just an individualized approach
Yeah.
with no hard percentage being defining. In other words, I don't
Sure.
need to reach 25. I don't need to restrict it to 5. I just try to monitor stress every single day and week. In other words, cumulative training stress. And I use stress in a positive context. And so I've got a number of individuals right now that I'm working with, and they'll probably do, they're not an Ellery, they're not a JoJo. But that being said, I've got one who is, or a couple who are probably in the 415 to 425 range for the mile, biological males. And those guys right now are probably accumulating maybe 15 to 70% of their weekly mileage in that so-called threshold range. So no hard number. It is less for those who are less developed and less fit. But we try to build it over 4 years or over 2 years or whatever time I have with them, because I think you could probably safely build it to 20 to 25% of weekly volume if you have, for example, 6 to 8 seasons with a student athlete.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I don't have anything else. Jason, do you?
Yeah, well, just to second that, we're one of those programs who have transitioned a lot of more threshold stimuluses more frequently. And we've had our averages have dropped significantly from where they were just 1 through 7, right? Not to mention everybody else along the way. So I can second that. They can recover from that. You can throw some extra stimulus in there and do those things, and they will be very successful from doing it. It's just easy to do if they can execute it.
Well, we're aligned, my friend, in the way I'll phrase it that hopefully resonates with your audience, because we have multiple types of workouts we can do. But threshold is your gold bullion for high school student athletes, because they can do it. They can do it safely. They can recover from it. They can accumulate it over weeks, months, seasons, years. That is your gold bullion. And if it's done well with really well-intentioned, passionate coaches who apply it artistically, knowing the foundational science, then to your point, good things are going to happen almost all the time. I'm not even going to say more often than not. I'm going to be more aggressive and say almost all the time, because they'll always be fit. And then the challenge becomes having them run their best when they want to and when it counts the most.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I said, Jason, I don't have anything else. I actually have so many questions, but I just think I have to bring you back on. We just don't have enough time.
No, this
Well,
has
I'll
been
come
great.
back anytime. I mean, I could do this with you guys, because I hope you know that whenever I'm with you two, I always learn. Eric, I can remember it was 2025 in Boulder, for example, when I can't remember who asked you the question, but you talked about doing hill sprints to enhance running economy.
Yeah.
And that for me was validating, because that's one of the reasons I believe in hill sprints. And I wasn't looking for confirmation bias. I was looking for a statement about why something is done by someone I respect and trust. And when you said that, it caused me to think, okay, my friend and I, my colleague and I are well aligned. I'm probably doing something that has positive value and is sustainable. So again, being around both of you is always a great learning opportunity for me. I mean that from the heart. So whenever I have this opportunity, I appreciate it. And anytime that I can help you all, anytime the three of us can chat because it helps me, just invite me back, name a time, and I'll be there.
We love that.
It's been awesome.
Yeah. Well, we thank you again for hopping on and sharing your expertise with us. We'll definitely take you up on that and bring you back. Another episode of the Low Stick Podcast. Eric Detman, co-host Jason Retz, with our special guest Jeff Messer. Like, subscribe, let us know what questions you might have or different topics you'd like us to talk about. But we're just really excited to keep bringing content. So thanks all for your time.
Thank you, gentlemen.